Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 53 of the Ask Historians podcast. So before we get started with today's episode, I have a couple announcements to make. The first being that all of your hard work and donations paid off, and Ask Historians presented in a panel at the American Historical Association in Atlanta just yesterday. That full recording is going to be, it's up on the Ask Historians subreddit right now. We have a link to the recording. I'm also going to be taking the audio from that and putting it out through the podcast. So if you want to go listen to it now, you can. If you want to wait a couple days for me to get that all together, you can you can wait for it to be downloaded to whatever device you're listening to this on right now. The second announcement is that we have met our very first Patreon goal for the Ask Historians Patreon to help support the podcast. We now have our normal hosting costs completely 100% met. So I just want to go ahead and thank Max M, Vlad, Elm, and Mark K for donating to being incredibly generous. I also want to give a special thanks to Andy B, whose contribution put us over the top, meeting that goal, and a very special thanks to Matt F, who was our very, very, very first pioneering patron. I don't know what the particular term is, but the very first person to open their heart to us in a monetary form. You've all opened your heart to us very much. Anyway, enough rambling. Let's talk about today's episode. So I'm sure you've all heard the saying that journalism is the first draft of history. Well, being academic snobs at Ask Historians, we tend to think that journalism's all right, but you know what's better? You know what's better as a first draft of history? Ethnography, because it's conducted in an academic sense. So this is another episode where I slip a little bit of anthropology into the Ask Historians podcast. Today we're going to be talking about Vodou, and particularly Haitian Vodou. We'll talk a little bit about some of the other kind of what our guest calls cousin religions or cousin practices in kind of the South, and a little bit around the rest of the Caribbean region as well. So we'll be looking at her fieldwork or ethnographic fieldwork, looking at modern day Vodou practices, but also we're going to be doing a sort of a crash course in Haitian history as seen through the lens of Vodou practices and how people have seen Vodou. And so we'll be talking about kind of how its role in the Haitian Revolution, how early on it was actually banned in Haiti by the people who succeeded in that revolution, who wanted to use it but not quite acknowledge it. We'll talk about the watershed moment of the 1915 US invasion of Haiti. And of course, we're going to talk about zombies. And of course, we'll also finish out by talking about the Duvaliers in Haiti, and also about the experience of Haitian Americans in the United States today. So it's a very fascinating and wonderful episode. Our guest was absolutely incredible to talk to her, and we had a lot of fun, as you can tell, because there's a lot of chuckling and giggling in this episode. So I apologize in advance for that, as I chuckle and giggle at you. So my apologies for that, and my apologies for actually none of this episode. It's wonderful. I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ask Historians podcast. Today, I'm here with a user known as Firedrops, but she goes by something different out in the real world. And we're going to be talking about Haitian Vodou, or whatever it happens to be called, as we may or may not learn here, I hope. So, Firedrops, why don't you go ahead and give us an idea about who you are and what got you interested in this subject?
Sure. So I'm a PhD student. I'm all but dissertation. So I'm a candidate at Boston University in cultural anthropology. I'm currently working on my dissertation, which is looking at Haitian Vodou practitioners in the greater Boston area and in Jacmel, Haiti. And I'm kind of looking at how they are crafting their particular religion to fit within the de facto congregationalism that you see most religions sort of eventually mold themselves into for an American public religion, due to certain cultural and also political, legal structures that we have.
So kind of looking about when does Vodou become the boring thing you do on Sundays?
Right, exactly. and how is it, it's a way of practicing an ethnicity in many ways, but they're undergoing many of the same debates that Judaism, for example, has had to deal with, do you have to be ethnically Haitian to be a practicing Haitian Vodou sant? That's one of the real big debates that's happening right now.
Yeah, well, what got you interested in this subject then?
I got interested actually initially because I did my master's work at Louisiana State University on modern voodoo practices in New Orleans, which is not necessarily Haitian voodoo. It's something a little bit different, though it has some similar roots at times. And I initially wasn't even going to do that at all. I was initially going to look at Sufis in New Orleans, which there was actually a surprising community. And then Katrina happened, and I started my master's right after Katrina and discovered that all the Sufis had fled and no community was left for me to study.
Your entire dissertation topic actually literally left.
Literally left. And I really had no idea what to do. And for a class project, for an ethnography course, a friend was like, hey, let's go down to New Orleans and interview a priestess. Like, let's find a voodoo priestess. It'll just be cool. And she was an archaeology major, and she didn't care about ethnography. So,
yeah, like archaeologists. Ugh.
right. She was just like, screw it, whatever. Let's do something fun. I'm not going to go do something boring. So we went down and we found Priestess Miriam, who is a really fascinating figure in New Orleans voodoo. And I was just like, this is just really cool. And no one has actually really done ethnographic fieldwork study that was intensive in New Orleans on modern voodoo practices. There are a number of actually pretty decent historical pieces about Marie Laveau, but nothing about sort of what does Marie Laveau mean today? What are the debates and tensions about that? So that's what my master's was about. And then I really wanted to see, what Haitian voodoo was and how that connected and how some of these debates were happening in with Haitian voodoo, which is, like I said, slightly different. And when I got into Boston University, it was a great opportunity because Boston is actually the third largest community of Haitians in America, but no one's done fieldwork with them with regards to Haitian voodoo.
Yeah, I find it really surprising that has not been already a source of field work. But, I mentioned that it may be called voodoo, it may be called not, and I hear you saying voodoo, but I see it kind of, voodoo in the traditional, like VOODOO, various spellings with like U, Vodun, hoodoo. What is the proper terminology for these? Because I know you've already said there's a difference between New Orleans and Haitian voodoo as well.
Yeah, so that is actually, well, a little bit of a debate within the communities, but most people who consider themselves Voodoo-sants spell it Vodou, and that is the Haitian Creole way of spelling it.
And Voodoo-sants are?
Those are people who practice voodoo.
Okay, so these are practitioners.
So practitioners, right. And those, so spelling it that way is the preferred way, in part because it is, people who practice typically Haitian Creole is their first language, and it's a language that many of the spirits, the mysteries, or the loa, it's what they speak at ceremonies. So using that spelling makes sense, but it's also a bit of a political statement because Voodoo is seen as the way that their religion is talked about negatively. So voodooism or voodoo, when it's spelled that way with a double O, is usually when people are talking about it in the sort of pop culture, James Bond villain type of way.
So it's a bit of a shibboleth in a way.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, and they were actually very proud a couple years ago. An organization that's here in the States managed to get the APA, or the AP, that when they write about voodoo in newspapers like in Routers and that kind of thing, to try to spell it Vodou.
Yeah, and the AP is the Associated Press.
Right, the Associated Press. So that was sort of a
major
big
international news organization.
Right. And it was, a way for them to really try to present, there's a big push to try to teach people about voodoo as a religion and not as some black magic or something like that. So you have voodoo, which is an actual, a full religion in the sense that there are, how you define religion is a hot debate, but there are spiritual beings who play active roles in people's lives and, moral codes and guides and implications for what happens when you sort of violate them, ideas about the afterlife and souls and those kinds of things that most people tend to think of when they think of a religion. Hoodoo is a term that's often used much more in the States about usually African American practices that may seem to have some roots back to West Africa, but are sort of stripped of any religious connections, right? And it's more about just sort of a magical, practical way of achieving a particular end goal. So you might see, if you want to break someone up, so for example, in Louisiana, where I grew up, a common thing you might see, there's certain kind of blood magic, right? That It's a little bit gross, but if you wanted to keep a man
I
true,
think I think most people associated voodoo already with some gross practices, so I don't think anyone is going to be surprised.
well, and this is actually not part of voodoo, right? So hoodoo is a little bit separate from voodoo in that it's not connected to that religious practice, but it's also sometimes coming from a wide disparate, areas of sometimes, even though we talk about it often as being African American and therefore we assume that a lot of it comes from Africa, there's a lot of European influence and sometimes some Native American influence, and of course unique things that have, developed in America as well. Um, but you would see people talk about how if you wanted to keep a man to be absolutely true to you, you could put a little bit of minstrel blood and some red sauce that he was going to eat. And that this was a magical way, a hoodoo way of keeping people true. And there are other things like a honey pot and those kinds of things. Some of it kind of crosses over into some Wiccan kind of practice as well.
So hoodoo is more of kind of like the practical aspect of like casting spells, doing, performing ritualistic magic, things like that. Well, voodoo is more of a actual kind of organized religion.
Yeah. I mean, and voodoo, of course, has aspects of that as well. But people who grow up in Haiti might not recognize a lot of what happens in hoodoo in the United States. And it gets complicated because you have voodoo being used as a term in a variety of places, right? In West Africa, you see it in Benin quite a lot being used to talk about the religion there, and people use it to talk about their own religion. During the slave trade, all these people were enslaved all along the west coast of Africa, the Ivory Coast and all that, and the Gold Coast, and brought over to the colonies in the New World, and there they mixed with whatever communities, were colonizing them at the time, and owning them and controlling them and forcing them to convert to Catholicism or whatever it happened to be. And so you have all these cousin traditions in a sense that they have similar parents, like they have similar West African ancestors, and then sometimes French colonial ancestors or Spanish colonial ancestors. And each place, cultivated its own somewhat unique tradition. But as you go from one to the other, you can see connections. Ogun is one of the spirits that if you can trace him all along West Africa, and he is a god of iron and thunder and a warrior king. And you can trace that all along West Africa, and then he's very important in many of the Afro-Caribbean traditions all throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. And in Haiti, he's known as Ogun. So these are all these sort of cousin traditions. When you say voodoo, sometimes people think of Benin, sometimes people think of just Afro-Caribbean traditions in general. Sometimes they think of New Orleans, which has its own communities, some of which are descended from the slave groups that brought over their traditions with them when they were enslaved, and some of them are a little bit more invented, recent traditions that are a little bit mixed with a little bit of Haitian voodoo and a little bit of neo-pagan and a little bit of New Orleans flair.
We're going to be talking about Haitian voodoo then. So what distinctifies Haitian voodoo?
Well, Haitian voodoo is distinct in a few ways, in part because of the Haitian Revolution that happened. So the revolution came and it started around 1791, but it took a while to spread. But during the revolution, you had about 2/3 of the slaves had been born in West Africa, many of them in the Congo, which had already kind of started to mix Catholicism a little bit with local traditions. But there were also a lot of people who were brought over enslaved because they'd been captured during the Civil War in the Congo, and they ended up being sent over. So you had a lot of people who were warriors and soldiers that the French were trying to control, which is perhaps not the best idea. They revolted, and voodoo became an important way of encouraging soldiers to fight and also blessing the enterprise of the revolution. And the revolution was very, very messy with all different kinds of sides involved, and it's quite complicated. You could have an entire podcast about just the revolution. But after the revolution, a lot of the countries like America had an embargo against Haiti. So then Haiti had a period of being relatively isolated. And that allowed the tradition to sort of develop in its own pathway in a very somewhat unique way, so that we have figures that come out of Haiti and Haitian voodoo that are not present in other traditions, ones that are unique. Like some of the revolutionary leaders have become spirits in Haitian Vodou, for example. And you have morals and frameworks that are very much linked to ways of life in Haiti. Those sort of family compounds and the kinship systems get reflected in the religious systems of relationships to the spirits and the spirits' relationships to each other.
Now, you had mentioned that a lot of these people coming over from, particularly from the Congo region, they're bringing a very kind of, I guess, martial spirit to it. And with the association with Ogun from the West African tradition, it sounds like there was kind of a somewhat militaristic cast to voodoo at the start of it, anyway.
There was in some ways. Certainly, when we talk about the revolution, everyone talks about the ceremony that happened at Bois Caïman, for example, which just means crocodile woods. And this was in northern Haiti, where some of the slaves met, and they had a small ceremony where they sacrificed a pig and said a prayer to the spirits to help them with the revolution they were planning. And it was really just a regional revolt of all the slaves at a number of plantations at once would revolt up, kill the masters, and then sort of it started from there. But it was the coordinating that really made it successful. And they continued to use ceremonies like that to encourage people. So we see Dessalines, for example, was well known for doing this, even though he was an important revolutionary leader. And on the one hand, he would say that voodoo was wrong, or that they would, crack down on voodoo in certain areas, because it was always sort of seen as a bit of a revolutionary character to it. And yet he used it quite often to create talismans, to encourage people to fight, telling them they couldn't die if you, did these prayers and these kinds of things. So it was a great way of organizing people and getting them impassioned to go off and do something very, very dangerous and something that they weren't sure that they were going to win. And so a lot of the way that you see voodoo now is, it's certainly not revolutionary in this sort of violent way. I mean, voodoo's not really a violent religion, but it always has a bit of that danger in the sense that it is revolutionary, or it has the potential to be revolutionary. It has
sort of a subversion of official power structures.
Yes. And we see this quite a lot, even in contemporary Haiti, where there are huge tensions between the rich and the poor. And the elites aren't terribly invested in helping the poor get out of poverty. And then that's a big overstatement, perhaps, because I'm sure there are plenty of elites who are. But in general, the poor don't have access to education. They don't have access to learn French. And everything official in Haiti happens in French. Even if you just want to send something at the post office or get a bank account, you really need to know French. So the poor don't have access to official realms of power. But voodoo can be a very powerful way of claiming agency and position, right? And voodoo is in many ways the religion of the masses in Haiti. So there's religious moments they can kind of go out into these elite spaces and subvert the sort of norms of how they're supposed to behave and act using voodoo.
Well, to loop back around to how this kind of developed, so you had mentioned that while many of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution were not particularly, voodoo sans themselves, they did kind of utilize it for their own kind of political aims. But what was the status of the practicing of voodoo during kind of that period of isolation, or the period of this independent Haitian state? Because I mean, at least officially anyway, Haiti has always been essentially a Roman Catholic country.
Yes, and in fact, Toussaint Louverture and some of the other big figures after the revolution tried to crack down on voodoo, because they were worried that part of the reason the rest of the world wasn't seeing them as a legitimate nation was that they weren't perhaps being seen as a Catholic nation. And they wanted to prove that they were civilized, that they should be afforded the rights of man. And for them, they thought that they needed to crack down on voodoo to do that. So voodoo was technically illegal in those early days, but they really had no way of enforcing that. And so Kate Ramsey has looked at the history of this and the sort of legal codes that were developed at the time, and some of the court cases that people dealt with, and the documents we have from that. And it's really interesting because there were attempts to crack down on voodoo, sometimes using the Catholic Church as an arm of this. So these anti-superstition campaigns, the Catholic Church would start and the Haitian government would support, and they would go village by village trying to get people to get rid of their idols and any altars that they thought were a little suspicious, and they would sometimes get like a little card that proved that they were voodoo free, and you had to present this card just to be able to get to be able to go to mass.
So a card-carrying non-voodoo sant.
Right. But the problem is voodoo is mixed with Catholicism, and it has been since the very start, perhaps even in West Africa. So Dambala, for example, is a snake spirit, and he is connected to St. Patrick, who has snakes at his feet. So you can go to a statue of St. Patrick, and you can say a prayer to St. Patrick, and really you're saying a prayer to Dambala, who is St. Patrick.
Different aspects of the same entity, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I've had it explained to me is that every voodoo sant in Haiti is Catholic, because you kind of have to be. But voodoo adds a layer of meaning, that their Catholicism is limited. They don't fully understand everything. And voodoo lets you see the depths of the really real. So many voodoo sants go to Catholic church. When you look at a voodoo altar, it's covered in Catholic icons and statues and monstrances, and crosses are everywhere. So the Catholic iconography is so important in voodoo that, how on earth would you ever really clean up a voodoo altar and get rid of the layers of symbolism, if you're allowing them to keep the Catholic symbols? So the whole card-carrying voodoo free is a little bit, BS. But it let people deal with navigate those tense political situations when all of a sudden the Catholic Church and the government descends upon you.
Well, I mean, it also seems like it'd be something that would take something that sounds like it was previously kind of an open, cultural, ethnic identity practice and kind of drive it a little more underground anyway. If you're going to try to get rid of, voodoo as this subversive thing that was giving your new country a bad name, it looks like you really just turned it into what we were talking about, that it always has this tinge of being kind of, revolutionary, as you might say.
Yeah, exactly. So it's always been a bit subversive in that sense, that it was the sort of secret religion of the slaves and then the secret religion of the citizens of early Haiti. And then we see this moving up through the US occupation of Haiti, for example, where voodoo became a really powerful way for locals to push back. So,
I guess I should, unfortunately, I would probably have to clarify which US occupation of Haiti.
Good question. So in 1915, President Woodrow Wilson ordered 330 US Marines to occupy Haiti. What had happened is there was a lot of worry about the German imperial ambitions in the Caribbean, and the US had backed a Haitian dictator named President Sam. And President Sam made the very unpopular decision to kill 167 political prisoners. So the people rioted, killed him, and then they decided to draw and quarter his body. Wilson saw this as a real threat. Some anti-American figures were looking like they were going to take over, and he sent in the Marines. So the Marines took over. They reinstated the conscriptions that had happened right after the revolution that were technically still in the Constitution, allowing the government to force the people to come in and work on things like roads and that kind of stuff.
So these are common labor obligations, which are technically on the books, but have not, I guess, been utilized for many, many decades.
Right. And we're not very popular, as you might imagine. Somebody, a foreign nation comes in, takes over your government. They didn't even let the Haitian flag fly at the time. And they're forcing people into forced labor to build roads and schools and things like that. And Haiti needed roads, but this was not the most popular way to go about that. There were a lot of concerns about the way that people were being treated. The NAACP actually even sent people to Haiti to check it out because it was such a big debate about the way that we were treating, this Black nation. And James Weldon Johnson wrote a number of pieces for The Nation about how horrible local Haitians were being treated, and he's very scathing. But there were figures in Haiti like Jean-Paul Mars who used this as a way to sort of really get support for his Haitian negritude movement, which was a movement that was trying to sort of reclaim those African roots as something to be proud of. And he argued that part of the reason that U.S. Marines were so racist and there were so many racial tensions and violence and things like that in Haiti was because they were discriminatory against voodoo practitioners. And he saw voodoo as a really important cultural piece of Haiti that needed to be supported. And so he's one of the really first prominent people who argued that voodoo was a real religion and that it was something to be proud of, and that it was a way of resisting U.S. Marine forces.
I would like to do like a huge multi-hour long tangent into how Haiti is seen as, the most African of Africans in America sometimes. But I think to stay a little more on focus, I mean, at this point, because that seems like it comes out of nowhere, this statement about voodoo. I mean, what did really people in the United States in 1915 know about voodoo?
That's a great question because, right, it seems like something that they wouldn't know much of anything about because even a lot of Americans today don't know a lot about Haiti. But in the 1800s, there were a lot of really popular stories in the newspapers with sort of yellow journalism and these sensational journalists who were writing about the infamous voodoo priestess Marie Laveau in New Orleans. And she was a really popular figure who was always creating scandals because the police would break up her ceremonies and there'd be white people there, right?
Scandalous.
It was absolutely scandalous. And she'd been a hairdresser who got to hear all the gossip when she was hairdressing and then use that to her advantage in a way that she, seemed to have these supernatural powers. And her daughter looked quite a lot like her as well. So it was easy to say Marie Laveau was in the same place at two times, or, in two places at the same time. So when she died in 1881, even the Boston Globe ran obituaries about her as a big piece. She was a big figure. And then you have these really sensationalized stories that were just, voodoo was just a sexy thing to write about. Like in 1891, the Salt Lake Tribune, which,
yeah, how more removed from Haiti could get,
right, has this piece that's titled Cannibalism in Haiti. It is part of a practice connected with voodooism, no uncommon thing to witness orgies at which human flesh is eaten. A woman eats her own grandchildren.
So it seems like we have this collusion of both, U.S., Monroe Doctrine going out abroad and swinging that big stick, along with, because I always associate Marie Laveau a lot with the spiritualist movement of the late 19th century.
Sure.
Along with really the golden age of sensationalistic tabloid journalism in the United States.
Oh, yes. And I mean, voodoo just made for some of the sexiest stories because it was exotic, but then there were these sort of homegrown elements with Marie Laveau, right? And the fact that there were, like I said, white people getting caught at this who were supposed to be from elite, nice families, a little touch of danger that it could happen to you. So it was something people were aware of. And voodoo had been stigmatized in the U.S. a little bit during the period, the antebellum period, because there were fears that the revolution would spread beyond Haiti. And there were already sort of discussions about how voodoo might have played a role in that. You also have those kind of roots a little bit in there. And then you also see, like, once the Marines get there, and there are these misunderstandings and interactions, of course, that are happening, but then you really see a lot of short stories popping up in newspapers and articles popping up in newspapers about voodoo. Like in 1918, the Boston Daily Globe had a piece about, it's like a little short story about this white explorer that goes to Haiti and discovers that this evil priest named Dessalines, who of course was a really important, Dessalines was the name of a really important Haitian revolution leader. So this evil voodoo priest is kidnapping white people and killing them. And this, brave white explorer manages to stop him and kill him. And at the end of the story, he donates money to this missionary organization that's going to convert these heathens.
I'm hearing that, and I'm really hearing like a lot of kind of connections to a lot of kind of the the darkest Africa stories that we see with a lot of, like, say, British imperialism, where they go in and they encounter cannibals with bones in their noses who dance around and then eat people. I mean, is this kind of the United States? Because this is, at this period, this is when the United States really kind of takes on kind of an imperial role, a colonialist role in relation to the European powers as well. Is this kind of the United States having its own experience of having, like, Africa in its backyard?
A little bit, I think. It certainly is a bit of an imperialist moment for America and going out and discovering that Africa is perhaps not as far away as they had thought. You also had people like Herskovits around that time, a little bit later, but around that time, who were writing about Africanisms in the New World and using African Americans as examples of how there's actually still quite a lot of African culture that remains for African Americans. So there's also this kind of rediscovery of this relationship that many people in America still have back to Africa that is a little bit shocking, I think, for a lot of Americans.
Yeah, so I mean, what was the actual scholarship of voodoo at this time then?
It's
If any, I guess I should say.
It's not great. We have pieces, for example, from Moreau de Saint-Marie, who was in 1789, he wrote about Haiti, and in it he wrote about voodoo and voodoo dances, and he wrote it in many ways because he was living in Haiti, he was a slave owner, and he ended up in Paris, but he was writing about Haiti in part because he saw everything kind of falling apart, and he wanted to desperately, record it as a way of kind of recreating. Haiti was the richest colony in the New World at the time. And he saw it as, this was his home and this is what he wanted to recreate. And then understanding the problems, which he saw voodoo as potentially one of them. And so he has this description, and it's something probably one of the earliest descriptions we have of voodoo in Haiti that's relatively, well, it's not neutral, but maybe semi-reliable.
It's neutral for the time it was written, I guess.
For the time it was written, right. And he does describe the ceremony that's happening in a way that is interesting and not necessarily like, it's all evil and cannibals or anything. It's just about sort of what does the dance look like and what are the people involved. And it's something that you can recognize pieces and strains of contemporary voodoo practice in. And then you start seeing a few figures coming out. In the early 1900s, there are a few early anthropologists that are doing a little bit of work on this, but they aren't as well known at the time. You also have people like Maya Deren, who's going down in the 1930s. So 1937 was the first time that she went down.
Yeah, well, who is Maya Deren?
Oh, yes. So most people probably don't know who Maya Deren is. But Maya Deren she was born in Europe, but she was American, and she was an experimental filmmaker. And really, she was known at the time for being an experimental filmmaker and being very avant-garde, but she got really inspired by some of the ethnographic films that Gregory Bateson was doing in Bali, and she decided that she wanted to do one of her own. So she got a Guggenheim and went down to Haiti in the early 1930s and decided that she was going to do, her Guggenheim proposal was that she was going to do an ethnographic film about Haitian Vodou dance. So she had read all these pieces, right? All this, some of it scholarly, a lot of it very sensational. And she decided that she was going to go down to Haiti and just see what was up. When she finished, what she had on her hands was actually quite interesting. Joseph Campbell, who is fairly well known for his work on folklore, he asked her to not only take the research that she had done and turn it into a book, The Divine Horseman. So she also has a film called The Divine Horseman, but she also wrote up this book. And the Maya Deren archives are actually at Boston University, so I got to delve through them while I was waiting on my IRB to come through. And it's fascinating because she has all of these journal pieces that she has kept, and then someone transcribed the conversations that she had recorded with her and Joseph Campbell, talking about her research and talking about how to frame it and how to talk about it and how to organize the books and all that. And her book was very, very popular at the time. Later, it went out of print, and more recently has come back into print and is now very popular today. A lot of people who are sort of rediscovering voodoo either as Haitian Americans or as people who are not Haitian who are interested in voodoo see Maya Deren as a really important figure for one of the first kind of descriptions of voodoo that felt like an insider was somewhat writing it.
Doing that, what ethnography does, which is just capture something at the moment of time and when it is practiced and how it's practiced and its meaning.
Right. And, Margaret Mead, who was a very famous anthropologist, hated her book. So this is not to say that, in fact, in the archives, there's this wonderful letter from Margaret Mead where she asks Margaret Mead if she would write a little piece for the back of her book, a little blurb or something. Mead was actually the person who did some of the stuff for her Guggenheim, like, I don't know, controlled some aspect of it. So I guess Darren probably thought that she had an in. And Margaret Mead just writes back, I enjoyed reading your book. It's beautifully written, much of it exceedingly evocative, and especially impressed the way you made the ritual essence come through.
So
But
far, so good.
I can't give you a blurb for it because any blurb I would give would have to be as an anthropologist, not a literary critic. If you'd let anthropology alone together and been contented to write a poetic and evocative book about Haiti, that would have been something I could endorse.
So a bit of academic gatekeeping there.
Right. But you didn't. As it is, methodologically, it's utterly unadmissible. The handling of the American Indian origins has nothing to do with anything, except, of course, poetry, at which level it's likely true. But bad documentation and poor methods spoil good poetry. I'm sorry.
Well, that's quite a shutdown.
Margaret Mead was a hard ass. She's kind of terrifying.
So, but anyway, with Maya Daren's work, are we seeing what we would now think of voodoo with kind of these ecstatic rituals of being, ridden by, Eshu or some other kind of Loa, animal sacrifice, lots of chicken bones. I'm shading over into kind of the stereotypical view, but what is the practice that we see at the time?
So with Maya Daren, we start to see a little bit something that I think people would recognize. It is, like Mead says, a little bit poetic and a little bit indulgent, a little bit navel-gazing for Maya Daren. But you start to definitely see things that you would recognize. And Daren sort of straddled that line a little bit, that she herself got possessed while she was there and really got involved in the tradition in a little bit more of a way than just a researcher. She didn't initiate, but she certainly became involved. So some of what she's writing does reflect the way that people tell me they experience possession, right? For example. And I think that was certainly a shift from the much more academic of Metro and people like that who were writing about voodoo, but as outsiders. And you get Darren writing about it as someone who's a little bit of that insider-outsider, but in a way that I think American audiences could definitely relate to and found very exciting and intoxicating, as opposed to earlier, like, members of the negative movement who are trying to use it for political kind of,
They're using it as their own symbol.
Right. And so you start seeing the voodoo that I have studied coming through in a much more evocative way, like I said, that's much more accessible, I think, to a lot of average Americans, where you have the family relationships that are incredibly important. That voodoo in many ways is about family and kinship and maintaining community relations. And that includes the relationships that you have with the Loa. So the Loa, or the mysteries, or the spirits, they technically live in Guinea, which is sort of Guinea means Africa, but it's really more of a spiritual Africa, or geographic imaginary. And they come across the waters and play very active roles in people's lives. So they are active agents in your everyday, and they take interest in different people. So each person's beliefs has a sort of spiritual court, anyone who's a practitioner does. And these are the spirits that are really interested in you as a person. And these are the ones you're going to work with and talk to. So you don't pray to a goddess of love or anything. You talk to the spirits that are involved in your life.
Yeah. So when you say a spiritual court, you don't mean like they're litigating. This is more of like a royal court in a way.
Right. This is sort of like a royal court. And that's the terminology that they use, is spiritual court. But it's also a relationship of often using familial terms. So this is Papa Ogu, this is Kuzunzaka, and you have obligations to them like you would to a father or to someone who's an uncle or something like that, in a very sort of traditional, rural, family compound kind of way.
So these spirits are personified, but they're also kind of mirroring actual people or actual individuals who would be filling roles in your real life.
They do. I mean, they of course are divine, and they're important in that way, and they can do things that average humans can't. They can heal, they can see the future, they can, do really important things in your life that human beings physically can't. But they are also there as emotional support. They come to you in dreams and they hold you when you cry. They help you get jobs, and they help you as this sort of spiritual network of people doing work for you. And they do play these sort of extended matriarch roles sometimes in people's lives. And people have complicated relationships with them at times. They fight with them. They talk back to them. They get in trouble with them. And their relationships are very human in some ways. And they do reflect the sort of different ideas of masculinity and femininity and social roles, and sometimes the lack of social roles, like they're ogus who are drunks and who can't get jobs, which kind of reflects, which reflects some of the problems that many Haitian men have today. That they
Just kind of, you're talking to the lower, and you're like, I asked you to do this 3 weeks ago, and you still haven't. Yeah, I mean, so this all sounds like a very warm, supportive, very kind of integrated into people's lives, religions. So what about the zombies? Because I think, because part of this is that it is kind of this, I'm not going to say an elephant in the room. I'm going to say it's a zombie in the room to keep the theme. But I mean, because that's what most people think about. So when do we really see that portrayal come out?
Yeah, so when you start to see little discussions of this, very briefly in some of the academic pieces and in some of the articles, the sensational stuff that's being written. But really, White Zombie, that 1932 film, which is really the first zombie film, that's where the American public really gets introduced to the ideas of zombies. And it's pretty interesting because White Zombie, it's set in Haiti, and it's Bela Lugosi is the evil voodoo priest who
I'm just laughing at the idea of Bela Lugosi as a voodoo priest.
Right. And he his name is his first name is Murder, I think, in the movie in the movie. And he
classic
hypnotizes, right? He hypnotizes a beautiful white American woman and makes her his zombie slave, right? And then of course all kinds of fights to get back the beautiful white woman. This was really the first zombie movie, and then zombie films just take off, and there are all these really bad B zombie films. And obviously today, if you look at The Walking Dead, we've moved significantly far away from its Haitian origins.
Yeah,
but
these zombie films of the time are people possessed by black magic, as opposed to
right.
literal walking corpses.
Exactly. And there's some interesting things, like Liza McAllister, who actually studies Haitian Vodou, has talked about how zombies tend to sort of reflect what are some of our deepest concerns in society at the time. So at the time, everyone's kind of worried about evil black magic and all these sensational stories that are coming out, as well as, of course, the Marines and the stories they're bringing back. And now we're concerned more, you think about 28 Days Later and all of the experimenting with evil biomedicine and,
mass plagues and epidemics and genetic modification and yada, yada, yada.
All these kinds of things. But anyway, so zombies in Haiti are actually really interesting. There are two kinds of zombie. There's zombie crocodile, which is what we know of, but there's also, so first you have to understand that in Haitian Vodou, typically it's understood that there are two souls. You have the Tibonage, which is just the little good angel, and it's the animating spark. It's what makes the difference between a living body and a dead body, but it's just sort of the engine that's running on idle. And then you have the Gros-Bonage, and that's the big good angel, and that's more where you have the personality and memories and what you would think of as yourself. During spirit possession, the Loa are able to kick out your big soul, your Gros-Bonage, and all that's left, it's like if you were driving a car, you pull the driver out from behind the wheel, and the car is left running, but not going anywhere. The Loa are able to slip in behind the wheel and control the car, and the person who was the original driver of the body doesn't remember anything during that period until they get their car back. So that's sort of like these souls are able to be disconnected from the body.
Now, this is a very sensationalistic practice. And I guess that's why it gets a lot of, a great deal, a disproportionate amount of press. But I mean, how common is this really? And because, we've been talking about when you're describing the practice of voodoo in most people's lives, it's spirits that support you, that you turn to for help, that you speak to in times of trouble. When does kicking out someone's big soul and autopiloting their body come in?
So spirit possession is an incredibly common thing in Haitian voodoo. Now, spirit possession isn't necessarily a zombie, but that's something that happens at every major public ceremony. That it's a really important role that many religious leaders provide the community, is that they give up their self, they sacrifice the self for the public, because it gives you direct access to the divine. Because when someone is possessed, I can go up to them and I can say, why didn't you do that thing for me? Or I need help, I can't find a job. Or they can come up to me and say, hey, you promised that you would sacrifice a chicken for me, or you promised that you would do this for me and you haven't. I've seen people get hit by the loa before during possession events because they failed to do something or they talked back. But you also see the loa heal, and they, sing and dance and eat food. That it's a really important moment where it's very imminent, the experience with the divine. What happens with zombie is actually rather rare for zombie kokadav. So there's the zombie form where you just, after someone dies, their little good angel kind of hangs around in the graveyard for a while. And it's possible to capture that, the little animating spark. And to use that, you capture it in like a bottle or something like that, and you can use that as something that works for you. So you can send it out, and it's like your little slave that goes and does things for you, or it helps, with a ritual that you need to have extra oomph, extra power for. And you have to feed it, though. If you don't feed it, it can turn on you. But as long as you feed it, it's sort of your little slave spirit that you can make do what you want. That's fairly common. And you see people doing that fairly often. The Rah-Rah parades often will start out.
Rah-Rah parades?
The Rah-Rah parades happen during Lent, and this is an important time when the poor can actually go into the spaces of the rich and present themselves using voodoo songs. But it's a sacred procession, and they're drumming and they're dancing for hours and hours and hours. So they will often have a small zombie like that they're using to keep them going. And then they release it at the end. The other kind of zombie, which is what, white zombie and all these things are based off of, is zombie kokadav. And this is what happens when a priest or priestess dishes out the ultimate punishment for a really serious moral transgression. So someone who is in incredible danger to the community, who has done something that's violated community safety and morality on a really, really deep level. This is like the worst punishment that you can get. And this was something that, ethnographers hear about all the time, but no one's ever actually really witnessed. Well, Wade Davis claims he's witnessed it, but some people question that.
Yeah,
but,
I do want to ask you about Wade Davis in a minute.
Oh, okay. So zombie kokadav believed that someone can actually, the priest or priestess, not the loa, but the priest or priestess can kick out that gros bonage. And what's left is your body with the animated spark still in it, the engine idling, basically, but with no one behind the wheel. And that they can then give instructions to this zombie and make it their slave to do whatever they want. And that this would be the sort of ultimate punishment to someone who really violated community ethics and morality, like was a real danger to someone. We also saw Duvalier, supposedly, who was an infamous dictator in Haiti in the 70s. Supposedly, he did this to some of his political foes, people who opposed him, that he supposedly turned them into zombie kokadav.
It seems like we have the two very, very distinct practices here, which, they're in a way a form of spirit possession, but one acts as kind of this a community focus, as there's this form of self-sacrifice to kind of embody the community in a way, whereas the other is a kind of a punishment that's visited upon someone who has transgressed the community, or in the case of the Duvaliers, their own personal ambitions. Am I kind of getting that right?
Yeah, when you're taking over the little animating spark spirit, that kind of zombie, it's not really a punishment, but some people don't like it, and they'll have a family member kind of guard their grave to make sure no one does it. But in general, you know,
Look,
it's
I may
not.
be dead, but I don't. But I earned death. Okay, I want a break.
Oh,
Uh,
but that's not the soul that goes on to be reincarnated. That's not the soul that goes on to become an ancestor. So it's less important. But
it's
when
it's a
you
body
have,
that's left behind, not
right,
the spirit in a way, or at least the important spirit.
right. But when someone steals your gros bonnage, that's a big deal. I mean, that's you yourself, and that's your eternal self. I mean, that's what goes on to become an ancestor. That's what goes on to be reincarnated later on in life. And so to have that ripped from you is just a huge, huge wound.
Yeah. So you had mentioned Wade Davis earlier, and he's an ethnobotanist
Hmm.
who did field work in Haiti. I believe in the early '80s,
Yeah,
early mid '80s, something like that.
he wrote The Serpent and the Rainbow, which got turned into, a film that had nothing to do
Yeah, I
with.
should say, okay, just as a disclaimer, if anyone is thinking instead of reading the book Serpent and the Rainbow, instead watching the movie, it has literally nothing to do with the book.
Right. So I think Wade Davis maybe got some money for it.
Well, yeah, it both gave him a paycheck, yes.
Yeah,
But
but
yeah, he came up with this very, because in kind of preparation for this, I've been asking people about like, hey, what do you know about voodoo? What do you know about voodoo? And all of them go back to zombies, but I also say, well, what causes a zombie? And they all come back to something that resembles his idea. So, what's this
yeah.
very popular idea that he put forward?
So his very popular idea is that there's an actual chemical concoction that's made up of, some poisons that they had access to and some other things that maybe don't do anything that put someone in a state where their heartbeat slows so much that it seems as if they are dead. And then the community, around them thinks that they are dead. But when they come back to, they are muddled and confused and easily controlled. And that for the general public, it looks like someone's been brought back from the dead. Other people who actually study the sort of chemical makeup of some of the things that he has proposed as being the pieces that went into this concoction have suggested that this wouldn't do that. And other ethnographers who have looked at it say that, the formulas for the supposed poison range greatly, and some communities don't even seem to use it at all. So even if there is such a poison that can make it seem as if someone has died, it's not the universal way that zombies are made in Haiti, and it's probably not the underlying, certainly cultural logic of why it's done, or the way that it then fits into what space that person occupies after it happens.
Yeah. So do we have a more kind of etic or outside perspective about how zombieism works?
Of course, like I said, we don't really have any great observations of anyone who is you always talk to someone who says that someone who knows someone, right? It's a little bit of an urban legend at times, and it's hard to know, is it really something that happens, or is it something that's sort of held over people as a threat that could happen? Certainly, Duvalier did lots of really horrible things to people, and the idea that someone could be found wandering in the mountains, addled and confused and after being tortured is not beyond the realm of possibility, and you don't necessarily need to be a zombie for that to happen, right? A lot of the descriptions sound like really severe PTSD. And Liza McAllister, who has looked at this, has argued that in some ways it's a metaphor for slavery and for some of the more modern forms of slavery that we still see happening in places like the DR and the sugarcane plantations. And there's still some really horrible, horrible conditions for Haitian workers. And of course, the things that were happening during some of the political issues throughout Haiti's tumultuous political history,
Yeah.
with people being tortured.
Yeah, well,
And
I mean, I can imagine, a country that was literally founded by slaves who fought for their own freedom and then ended up with a very strongly stratified society. I can imagine that involuntary servitude and bondage would be, well, I mean, it goes back to what we were saying about zombies reflect the fears of the society. I
mhm,
imagine there'd be a very strong fear.
very much so. And it was one of the big things with the U.S. Marine occupation that all these people were being conscripted, and there were all these descriptions of these people being sort of turned into zombie in some way by the American Marines.
Oh, well, I just want to kind of return back to more of kind of like a chronological kind of stepping forward to this because, we've mentioned the Duvaliers several times here, but, they're kind of very intimately tied into some of the ideas about voodoo because well, I'll let you explain who are the Duvaliers and how do they relate to voodoo?
Sure. Jean-Claude Duvalier is a sometimes called, or I'm sorry, that's his Francois Papadoc Duvalier. We should start with him. Papadoc was born in 1907, and he studied ethnography actually in Haiti. And some of the ethnographic things that he studied was voodoo. And he ran in 57 on this sort of black nationalist platform, like we need a real black of the people, because in Haiti you have the sort of mulat, or the rich elites who claim a lot of French heritage, and then you have the neg, the black lower class populace. And so he was running on this, like, we need a black president, we need someone of the people. So he became president in 1957, and pretty quickly declared himself to just be, by 1964, he declared himself to be president for life. He had this huge cult of personality, but he was very, very brutal. It's estimated somewhere between 30 to 60,000 people in Haiti were killed by him or on his orders, who opposed him. And he also instituted the Tonton Macoute, which were these paramilitary groups. The Tonton Macoute is actually sort of the boogeyman in Haitian folklore, the one that comes when children are naughty and kidnaps them. That's the name that he chose for his own sort of personal military groups. And he would purposely dress like Baba Gede or Baron Samedi, which are the sort of spirits of the dead. And he would try to evoke that symbolism when he would go out in public and give speeches and try to be terrifying in that way. And he also purposefully tried to get voodoo priests involved in the Tonton Macoute. And they were incredibly violent. They were these little warlords in a lot of ways in these different regions. He would give them a lot of autonomy, and they could do whatever they wanted. They could take whatever women they wanted, whatever lands they wanted. And a lot of people that I've gotten to talk to in the US, in the diaspora, who came over during that time, have really, really horrible stories of things that happened to their families. It was just incredibly violent. And
yeah, well, I just want to go back to the Tonton Macoute because,
yeah.
A lot of time when people hear like, oh yeah, that was, they were called the boogeyman. It seems like a lot of times when they're portrayed it as almost a kind of infantilizing force in Haiti that, Haitians would be scared of, the boogeyman. But, when you say that, tens of thousands of people disappeared, it kind of goes back to this idea about, it's not surprising to find someone who's scared and disoriented after they've been, brutalized.
Yes. And yeah, it sounds infantilizing to be like, oh, the boogeyman would scare adult people. But the reason he picked it was because he wanted it to tap into that very primal childhood fear. He wanted people to be terrified and to immediately fall in line. And they had, even though he didn't issue uniforms, they had uniforms they were supposed to wear that were somewhat military looking, but they always had these sunglasses, for example, and these big shiny, almost you think of just black sunglasses. And even today, a lot of people in Haiti do not like to wear sunglasses, certainly not sunglasses that look like that, because of what it symbolizes politically, that it symbolizes that reign of terror. So just those kinds, something as simple as sunglasses became such a symbol of fear for so many people. He really just it was allowed him to take a community, Haiti is very mountainous and the roads between certain regions aren't great. So having control like that, like the kind of iron grip over the entire island, or the half island that makes up Haiti, is actually more difficult than you would think looking at how small the island is. But if you set up these little warlords who are all beholden to you, and they have control, and all these people that they run in that little region, then you can really very deeply control and immediately stamp out any kind of resistance.
Well, it sounds like, you had said that part of what he ran on, his platform, was to have a man of the people leading the country. And it seems like in a very kind of tragically ironic way, that's kind of what they got, is that someone who, because you had said, previously voodoo had been kind of looked upon as this stigmatizing thing for the country and had been, banned and forced underground, that it seemed like he legitimated it in a sort of way, but in a way that supported his own power.
Right, and that he co-opted in many ways. There are all kinds of debates about whether or not he actually practiced in any way, or if he just used his ethnographic studies. I mean, he used to write for a journal, for example, but he got involved in the Negritude movement along with people like Jean-Paul Mars, and used Haitian Vodou politically that way to be like, let's be proud of Haiti. And then once he got in power, he was able to use those same symbols, not just say, let's be proud of Haiti, but then Haitians, you should be, afraid of me, and to control that same community. So yeah, the sort of double-edged sword of using Vodou politically that way.
And these practices were continued under his son, right?
Yeah, so Baby Doc was maybe slightly better, a little less violent. It wasn't.
Well, I mean,
he kind of has
after tens of thousands of people who would protest have been killed, you kind of have the luxury of not having to do that.
Right. So Baby Doc was known a little bit more for just spending a whole lot of money, and being a little bit more into partying. But he also, he made a lot of money off the drug trade. He really made, Haiti was just incredibly poor during his control. And then he had like a $2 million wedding. And people finally, under Baby Doc, really began to sort of be ready to throw off that yoke. And, he was getting in trouble for embezzlement and for, I think just seeing that kind of lavish, like the $2 million wedding really didn't go over well at all, which maybe is not surprising because it was incredibly, the poverty in the 80s was so extreme in Haiti.
It delegitimized him in a way,
really
where his father had been a man of the people, even in a very kind of terrifying and horrific way. He clearly was not.
Yes. And he was clearly a spoiled little rich boy, and that did not go over well. That was, and he was also like involved somewhat legitimately, it seems, or not legitimately, but it seems like the reports of this were somewhat legitimate, and like selling body parts of dead Haitians, like in the organ trade, which obviously does also not go over terribly well with your people. But
to not to get too far into Haitian politics, but to loop us back around to, so this time we also see a big influx of Haitian, I guess, political dissidents, refugees, exiles, immigrants coming to the United States. Does that influence the way that, Vodou begins to be seen in the United States? Because we've seen, as we were talking about it seems like there's been a movement to strip away some of the stereotypical mystique.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was something that Haitians in America underwent a few different moments, because you had the CDC had their 4-H club that came out in the 80s. That was a way of trying to, I think it was 1982, they came out with this list of things for identifying potential vectors of HIV. And the 4-H club included hemophiliacs, homosexuals, heroin addicts, just intravenous drug users, and Haitians. And so Haitians had been in the process of sort of creating a unique ethnic identity, and in part to combat the racism of America, claiming that, we're not African American, we're Haitian, right? And sort of trying to carve out that space to give themselves and their children a place of social mobility. And then suddenly Haitian became synonymous with AIDS, which in the 80s, people were panicking about AIDS. They didn't really understand how it was transmitted, and people suddenly couldn't sell their houses if they were Haitian. They lost their jobs, they get kicked out of churches. And so people were a little bit terrified to publicly be Haitian. So there was actually this period after 1982, during the real height of the AIDS epidemic, that people who were Haitian in Haiti, who had been in that process of trying to sort of create a pride about being Haitian and having Vodou be part of that, suddenly went underground in a lot of ways about their identity. People were kind of afraid to be Haitian in America because they were afraid of the stigmas attached to that, not to do with Vodou, but to do with AIDS. So one of the things I'm looking at now is that you have a lot of people who are second generation Haitian Americans who are trying to reclaim their heritage of being Haitian, and sometimes their parents are a little bit terrified of this. but they're trying to reclaim that heritage, and part of that is rediscovering voodoo. Just like we saw with the negritude movement in Haiti during the American occupation, we see people trying to sort of reclaim being Haitian by going back to the folk, which is not necessarily a new thing or unique to Haiti, but the folk being connected to voodoo. So this kind of reclaiming a voodoo and trying to present it in a positive light in America, I would say really starts getting going in like the 1990s. In the past maybe 5-10 years is really when you've seen most of it. So I guess like getting the AP to spell it differently has only happened in maybe the past 5 years.
To kind of bring us to an epilogue here, I kind of just ask you, when they have to listen to this and, when they're out in their normal world, what should they take away from this? What is voodoo? I mean, is it an organized religion? Is it a set of ethnic practices? Is it both? Does that matter?
Both. So voodoo is, of course, practiced differently in different places. And part of it, there's no pope of voodoo. There's no central leader. So in some ways, it's like Baptist churches in America, where if you aren't terribly thrilled with your particular congregation, you can just go start your own, right? And there is certainly concepts of respectability, and people are asked to come in and do services at other voodoo congregations. And if you can't figure it out, well, then that speaks poorly upon your congregation. So there's hierarchies within the congregations, but they are relatively independent of one another. Yet they do share central concepts of, community, and they're very, very focused on ensuring that they support family and share resources and support one another through these networks, both spiritually and actually, with members of the group. And so it is an organized religion in that way. But there are also folklore aspects where people who don't necessarily practice, don't consider themselves voodoo saints actively, they don't initiate, they don't go to ritual or routine ritual services, who will turn to voodoo when things aren't going well, right? They need help.
It's not an unfamiliar thing for a lot of religions.
It's not. Certainly, there are quite a lot of people who, when things go bad, turn to religion. But voodoo also provides certain pathways of very practical things, like you need to get a job, you need healing. There's a lot of focus on healing. And of course, it's not surprising considering Haiti has very poor access to medical care, and certainly very poor access to mental health care. Voodoo priests and priestesses often end up being de facto therapists. They know a little bit about, leaves and what to give you to heal some very common ailments. Sometimes they can set broken bones, but they can also call upon the spirits to help heal. I've been to ceremonies in Haiti where doctors, were unable to heal a young girl. And so they had gone initially to their Protestant church and they were unable to heal. So then the last-ditch effort was coming to the voodoo temple and hoping the voodoo temple could help them heal the girl's ailments. So there's also a very practical side of it as well. But, there's a bit of also ancestral worship. It allows people access to the dead, to continue having conversations and relationships with the dead, and to history. It allows people to feel very connected to their communities historically and back to Africa, to feel rooted and to feel proud of who they are. So voodoo in Haiti, like religion in most places, provides multiple layers of engagement and meaning for people. It can be a really important source of getting respectability and respect in the community, of getting jobs, like actually getting something that gets paid, which is really hard to do for a lot of people in Haiti, especially for men. Voodoo provides a pathway that even if you're illiterate, you can become very respected for your deep knowledge, and you can get paid decently for your services, for being able to do things. And you don't have to do that daily hustle of scrounging at the marketplace and just desperately trying to find a way to feed your family. So it provides some social mobility. It provides healing. It's great for, communities. There's all kinds of gossip that happens at the temples between services and social relationships that are strengthened. In the cities, people initiate quite often in order not just to get a community for religious services, but you immediately get a fictive kinship with, family members. Even if you're disconnected from your actual blood family because you hadn't moved to the city, you instantly get the sort of congregational family. So it's a religion, it's an ethnicity, it's also social mobility and job opportunities, it's a sense of identity, it's political. It provides a lot of different things for people. Although it's very hard to define succinctly. But I think, in general, I think a lot of Americans, when I talk to them, they've gone there and they've built a school or something like that, and their engagement with voodoo is very minimal, if at all, and there are still a lot of stereotypes. It seems very scary to a lot of people. And in general, it's really not. I mean, I've gone to enough ceremonies now that it's almost mundane. It's almost like going to church on Sunday, and it's still beautiful and very intimate and very important to people. And I still see that, but it's also just part of the everyday,
So, Liz, thank you for taking voodoo and making it everyday, banal, mundane, and boring. And thank you for speaking to us today.
Thank you.
And as always, thank you all for listening, and thank all of you for making history interesting through your donations to the podcast, through our Patreon, and also to those of you who donated to help fund the campaign to get members of Ask Historians at the American Historical Association this year, where, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we had a panel presentation, and I will be getting that audio up soon. That was a really, really amazing undertaking, and I have to also give a kind of a shout out to the Reddit admins, staff, business side of things who help pony up a great deal of money to afford airfare and fees and all that, including getting someone all the way up from New Zealand, which coincidentally you might know as the country that gets left off of maps the most. It's support like that from the community, not just from the higher red hat community of the admins, but also just from the users like you who are listening right now, and the people who help participate and ask questions and give great answers in the subreddit as well, that helps keep us going and fuels our energy and gets us all warm and fuzzy inside. So I hope today's episode helps shed light on a topic that is really, for a lot of people, more myth than reality, while at the same time giving insight into a country which is often sometimes more myth than reality, sometimes to a lot of people as well. Haiti is a very unique story in the Western Hemisphere and almost really kind of in the world history at large. And voodoo is just an amazingly, I guess you could say, American in the sense of, American Western Hemisphere, of the Americas. It's a very American phenomena in the fact that, as our guest pointed out, it draws upon not only West African traditions, but also Native American and European traditions, and kind of blends it together in this syncretic whole that becomes, as you can see for a lot of people, something that is a very vital part of their lives, and also something that has echoes throughout the American South, and although we didn't really touch on it that much, things like other kind of Afro-Caribbean religions, as well as South American religions as well, like Candomblé. It's one of those things that once you scratch the surface, you can really go further and further deeper into the subject. So we'll be putting up the discussion post, so I hope you have some excellent follow-up questions for our guests there. In the meantime, do keep rating and reviewing us on iTunes. That helps keep us at the top of the charts somehow through some sort of voodoo, you might say. Oh, our guest is not going to like me using it so politely. It helps us do something to help keep us at the top of the charts on iTunes, so people will see the podcast. And then when you want to talk about the history of Haitian voodoo with other people, you have lots of other people who have listened to it with you. Rate us, reviews on whatever other streaming service you have. That does a similar kind of keeps us warm and fuzzy, but also helps keep us visible to other people, so we can help grow the community. So again, you can talk to people about these wonderful things you're hearing about. And feel free to go by the Ask Historians Patreon. That's patreon.com/AskHistorians if you want to help support the podcast. Our next funding goal is going to be $35 a month, and that will help us get a fully paid up SoundCloud account so we can put all of our back episodes on there, as opposed to just kind of the two most recent we have. And after that goal, we'll start getting that's when we start getting into the fun stuff. What I'm planning on doing is basically, once we hit a certain amount where we can get a nice history book and academic text to kind of give away every month, we'll hold kind of a raffle for people who've donated at a certain level. So until then, we'll see you in 2 weeks when we will be talking to Schlin28, and our topic will be the political relationship between the East and the West in Europe following the fall of Rome.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.